Hi everyone. I wanted to show you a quick little example of how we can create a RESTful API using RAML. And I'm going to be using this handy little editor that's running in my browser. It's got actually a couple of modes. You can switch it into dark mode, which is the way I usually work. But for this video, I'm actually going to use the light mode because I think it captures better. So this is an example of a RESTful API captured in RAML. I've put in here the title, World Music, because I want to build a tiny little example of a world music service that serves out songs from all over the world based on the genre. Now it's a RESTful API and I haven't deployed it anywhere, so I don't have a base URI yet, so I'm just going to design it. And for a RESTful API, first thing to do probably is to choose the resources. So I'm going to start with a collection of songs, and in RAML you capture it in this way. Basically give the relative URI of that resource. And what can I do with something like that? Well, down here on the bottom, you'll see there's a little shelf that gives me the various options I can use at that moment if I don't remember all of REST or all of HTTP. But in this case, I'll just find it easier to type. So I'll put in a get, and I'll put in a post, because I can get that collection and I can create a new item in that collection. It's probably all I want to do on a collection. And how about an individual member in that collection? I'm going to address it by the song ID. And on that individual member, I can get it. I can update that individual song through a put if I want to submit the entire song, or a patch if I want to give it partial update. And then it's a full CRUD API, so I'm going to be able to issue a delete. And of course I can go in a moment and add parameters and bodies and schemas and so on. But for now, that's a pretty good layout of my RESTful API. And in RAML, that's all you need to actually specify your API. So let's go here on the right, where this console is showing you, and this is a very early version of the console, but it's showing you that you've got a songs collection with a get and a post, an individual member addressed this way. It's got a URI parameter, which is the song ID. I haven't added descriptions or anything yet. But the cool thing is that you can probably show this RAML file to anyone, and they'll pretty quickly understand that this is indeed the structure of your API with a collection and a member and so on. Now let's flesh it out just a little bit more. On the get of a collection of songs, I probably want to add a way to filter this out, maybe by genre. So I'm going to add a query parameter, genre, and I'm going to describe it. So it is nice to have a little bit of documentation. Filter by genre. And again, that's all I had to do to type. Is to type it in order to create this API. All I needed to do to specify this parameter is just type it in, and you'll see here on the right that I've got the genre parameter. It's type string, which is the default, and it shows us to filter by genre. Okay, cool. Now one of the things that RAML really encourages you to do is to start capturing patterns and reusing them over and over again. As this API grows, I don't want to have to redefine what is a collection and what is a member and how do I filter and so on. So let's see how RAML allows you to do that. Let me switch over here to another tab, which started to capture a few of the patterns. And usually I would include those from some remote, say, CDN, where I'm hosting my common schemas and types and traits and so on. But in this case, I wanted to inline them so you can actually see what they look like. Here's some schemas that I've defined. Here's a simple JSON schema for a song. It's got a title and an artist. Turns out they're both required here. Here's a schema for an artist, and you can keep going. Define it for multiple songs. Now, resource types is a way to capture things like collections and members and other types of resources, and this supports inheritance. So we'll define a base resource type just to show you it captures the standard responses of 200. But you've also got a collection. It inherits from the base, and it's got the get and the post. Again, we don't need any other methods on this. It defines the standard response type. It also takes as a parameter the schema. So you can pass in a parameter and reuse this collection for lots of types of schemas. One other kind of pattern is traits. So these are more behavioral things. Paged is an example of that, where I can define a couple of query parameters, the start parameter and the number of pages. Secured is another one. And even though RAML supports security schemes here, I just wanted to simplify things and define a secured trait. It requires the authorization header and comes back with the 401 if you're not authorized. So with these simple patterns captured, let's go and recreate that same API we had before. Here's the songs collection, and instead of typing everything out now, I can just declare that it's of a type collection. In fact, I'm going to pass this type a parameter, that's the schema, and its value is song. I'm going to also secure this, at least declare that it's secured. And let's go ahead and define an individual member again. The type this time is a member, and the schema is a song. And let's secure this one again. And with these, 6 lines of definition, which are pretty readable. It tells you that songs is a collection of type or schema song, it's secured, and so on. So with these 6 lines, I've pretty much defined a pretty full API here. If I look, for example, at the songs, I can see that it's got the start and the pages because I define my collections to be paged. I can see on the response, I can get a 200, I can get a 401 because it's secured. Here's the JSON schema for it. And then the full console, you've actually got a try it button where you can go ahead and issue requests against this API. And there's a mocking service coming as well, which will mock this API as you type it out and quickly allow you to play with it, make sure that it's getting the kind of, doing the kind of behaviors that you wanted. And here's the same thing for the individual member. You can see that, for example, in a patch, there's a request that takes that schema, a response for the 200 and a 401, and so on. Okay, cool. Now, there's a few other things that I wanted to show you, and they're around what you can do once you have a good, clean API description. And one of those is to allow you much easier exploration of an API. So I don't know if you're like me, but when I go and explore an API, typically I open up some console and I issue a request to the URL. I get back the parameters. I then need to open up a new tab and copy paste those results that I got in the first call into the new tab, issue another call, because most of the use cases you require multiple steps in an API, maybe across multiple APIs. So once we have the API definition, we actually came up with a nice little tool to help you simplify those kinds of things and actually share those little use cases with other people. So I'll switch over to another tab here. We've got something called the notebook that we've built up. And in the notebook, you can actually just point at RAML files, auto-generate clients for them, and go ahead and script into those clients. So in this case, here's a particular location of my RAML files. And that can be wherever those RAML APIs are documented. If the API that you're calling hasn't been documented by the API provider, you might find documentation in RAML form somewhere else, and you can go ahead and use that. So with that in place, I'm going to go ahead and auto-generate a client for this particular API. And because we've got the music service documented in a particular place on that specs library, I can just point my notebook to that, /music/api.raml. And once it grabs the description of that API, it auto-generates a little client for me. Now, I don't have to read much about the documentation because the notebook here has enough information and the client knows exactly the API, so it helps me autocomplete. And I can see that I have a get and a post and so on this. I'm going to go ahead and get all the songs by a certain genre. Let's pick, I don't know, I can do rock, reggae. Let's go with reggae this time. And see what we get when the API call is made. So what we get back is an object that has a body and has headers. Let's look inside of the body. Here's 5 different objects that came back. All right, this looks reasonable. So I'm going to set a variable here called mySong. And I'm going to refer back. I can make an API call again, or I can just refer back to the previous result, $2.body, and I'll grab the first one. All right, so now I've got a variable. It's holding the song that I want. And let's go ahead and post this to a social network. Now, I don't have the OAuth 2 here all configured, so I've got a service that looks like a social network but isn't actually one. Let's go ahead and create a client for that as well. I'll call it not FB, and I will point it rather to my RAML file and create a client for that as well. And now I can see that this API requires my user ID, and it has a feeds API, and that feeds API supports a post method where I'm going to pass it a parameter called message, and I'm just playing around here. I'm going to post the title. And let's look directly at the body that comes back. Cool. All right, so if this were the real social network, it would have posted this to my social feed. And it's a pretty interesting example of how to mash together the world music API. I'm going to add a little bit of documentation here. I'm going to say, here are my RAML files. And let's add a documentation here to say, save my favorite song, but you can change it yourself. Okay, and this is a live notebook showing a particular use case. What's really cool is I can actually share this with other people. So let me give this a name. This is a world music use case. And if I share this link with anyone else, here's what they'll end up seeing. I'll just refresh the page here. And the notebook will load up exactly that data. And anybody else will be able to do this and also end up running their own example. So let me just hit the run button here. So I can run things individually, or I can run them all together. In this case, I'll go ahead and run them individually. So anybody else can go and create the client. They can change this, say something else. They can set the song to be that, authenticate themselves if they need to, and go ahead and paste it to their wall. So we think this is going to be a pretty interesting way to save API use cases, share it with other people. And one of the things that is kind of cool about this is that we don't even have to use the proprietary format to save this notebook. Let me give you an example of, or a preview. Let me show you the internal format of this. I'm going to copy the ID of this notebook. And you can't see this, but I'm going to the gists on github.com and pasting in the ID of that notebook. And you'll see that that entire notebook is really just a markdown file that happens to have fenced code blocks inside of it. And the notebook is just smart enough to realize that those fenced code blocks can actually be run and offer you to run them. Let me see if I can show you the actual markdown here. So here's the actual markdown that we saved. This is all the data that the notebook needs. Okay, thanks. I hope you enjoyed this little example of RAML.